Thousands of New Yorkers are staring down a nightmare that nobody thought would arrive this quickly. Families who believed they finally had some level of stability are now being told the money's running out. The programs are collapsing, and by the end of the year, many of them may not even have a roof over their heads. These are people tied to the city's housing voucher programs that were sold as a lifeline, a guarantee, a promise that government would take care of them. But now the funds are drying up years earlier than expected, and suddenly, thousands of people are finding out that promises made in political speeches do not always survive reality. And while ordinary New Yorkers are panicking about where they're going to sleep, the political machine that created this crisis continues to push the exact same ideas that led to it. People are leaving the city in massive numbers. Others are living inside RVs parked on side streets. Entire neighborhoods are watching affordability disappear in real time. Yet somehow, the loudest voices in the city keep demanding more taxes, more government control, more spending, and more dependency on systems that are already breaking apart.
The city keeps doubling down on policies that are making life harder while pretending those same policies are the solution. For many residents, this crisis feels deeply personal because they have spent years waiting for help that never came. One woman joined the waiting list for public housing back in 2016, believing her situation would eventually improve. Nearly a decade later, she is still waiting. Her life has changed, the city has changed, the economy has changed, yet her name is still sitting somewhere on a list, while thousands of apartments remain empty and unusable. The most shocking part is that these units already exist. They are physically there. Buildings full of apartments stand in the middle of New York City, while desperate people wait years for access to them. At the same time, entire stretches of neighborhoods are now lined with RVs and makeshift mobile homes. Streets that were never designed to become permanent living spaces are slowly turning into unofficial encampments.
Residents complain about it, city officials conduct occasional crackdowns, but nothing actually changes because the people living inside those vehicles have nowhere else to go. When authorities tow the RVs away, the owners simply move to another part of the city and park again because the underlying problem remains untouched. The deeper issue is that New York has created a system where the demand for affordable housing massively outweighs the supply. Yet instead of focusing on building huge amounts of new housing, politicians continue expanding programs that redistribute access to a limited number of apartments. Voucher systems grow larger every month, while the number of actual homes barely increases. The result is predictable. Prices keep climbing, competition becomes more brutal, waitlists explode, and the government runs out of money trying to subsidize a shortage it never solved.
Officials themselves have admitted the growth is out of control. Programs that were expected to grow slowly are now increasing at shocking rates every single month. The costs are multiplying faster than anyone predicted, and now state leaders are demanding budget cuts because the city cannot sustain the pace. But the political problem is enormous because politicians spent years promising voters more benefits, more protections, and more free services. Walking back those promises now risks public outrage from the same people who were told government could provide everything. Meanwhile, rallies continue across the city, with crowds demanding rent freezes, free transportation, city-run grocery stores, expanded subsidies, and even more taxes on wealthy residents. The rhetoric sounds emotional and powerful in speeches, but there is almost no discussion about how long any of it can realistically function if the people funding the system continue leaving. High earners, businesses, landlords, and investors increasingly feel like targets rather than partners in the city's future. And once enough of them decide the environment is hostile, they simply relocate somewhere else. The city's housing authority has become one of the clearest symbols of dysfunction. Thousands of apartments remain empty because renovations move painfully slowly. Buildings deteriorate while families wait decades for units that technically already exist. Money disappears into bureaucracy, repairs drag on endlessly, and nobody seems capable of fixing the backlog. Residents look at boarded-up apartments while living in shelters or RVs and wonder how a city this wealthy cannot prepare housing that is already standing there.
For struggling New Yorkers, the emotional frustration is overwhelming because many of them are not asking for luxury. They simply want a safe place to live at a price they can afford. But the political conversation rarely focuses on increasing supply fast enough to meet demand. Instead, the city becomes trapped in endless debates over redistribution, regulation, freezes, caps, and subsidies, while the basic shortage continues getting worse year after year. Critics of the current leadership argue that the city government behaves as though profit itself is immoral. Developers who want to build housing are often treated with suspicion. Landlords are portrayed as villains. Businesses that generate wealth are viewed as exploitative rather than essential to economic growth.
This creates an environment where investment slows down because the incentive to take financial risks weakens dramatically. And when fewer people build, shortages become permanent. Some politicians openly embrace socialist language and argue that wealth redistribution is the only path to fairness. Supporters cheer these speeches because they believe concentrated wealth is the root of inequality. But opponents warn that once a city becomes dependent on continuously taxing a shrinking pool of productive residents, the entire structure becomes unstable. If enough taxpayers leave, the math eventually stops working, no matter how ambitious the promises sound.
At the same time, New York faces enormous homelessness challenges that cannot be ignored. Hundreds of thousands of people struggle with housing insecurity, shelters remain overcrowded, and affordability keeps slipping further out of reach for working-class residents. Yet, instead of flooding the market with new construction, the city often creates more layers of regulation that slow projects down and make development even more expensive. The shortage deepens while officials attempt to subsidize their way through it. That is why RV communities have started appearing more frequently. For some people, living in a vehicle has become the only remaining option that offers any sense of independence. Paying thousands of dollars for a tiny apartment feels impossible, so they choose mobility instead. Many residents understand why these encampments exist, even if they dislike the conditions around them. They recognize that these people are not choosing luxury, they are improvising survival.
The collapse of federal voucher funding has now made everything even more chaotic. Money allocated through pandemic-era rescue programs has dried up years earlier than expected, leaving thousands of voucher recipients in limbo. Families who structured their lives around assistance programs are suddenly being told the support may disappear. Some are being redirected into already overwhelmed public housing systems that cannot even maintain the units they currently manage. For residents losing vouchers, this situation feels like betrayal. Many of them contribute part of their own income toward rent and are not simply living entirely free of charge. But because housing prices remain astronomically high, even partial assistance becoming unavailable can mean immediate displacement. People who were barely surviving now face the possibility of homelessness, despite following every rule the system demanded of them.
And the cruel irony is that many of these individuals could potentially afford housing if enough apartments actually existed. The issue is not always a complete lack of income. The issue is that supply is so restricted that even middle-income earners struggle to compete. When construction fails to keep pace with population demand, everyone suffers, except those who already own scarce property assets. As this crisis unfolds, city authorities continue conducting enforcement operations against RV encampments. Vehicles get ticketed, towed, and relocated, but none of it solves the root issue. Removing one encampment simply pushes residents into another neighborhood. The city ends up managing symptoms instead of causes, while frustration spreads among both homeowners and displaced residents alike. Housing is not the only affordability problem crushing New Yorkers either. Grocery prices, restaurant bills, transportation costs, utility expenses, and everyday necessities have all surged dramatically. Longtime residents describe watching prices climb year after year until basic life in the city started feeling impossible. Even something as simple as a hot dog that once cost cents now costs several dollars. Businesses argue that rising costs come from endless regulations, taxes, theft, labor expenses, insurance increases, and energy prices. Shoplifting alone has become a major burden for many stores. When large amounts of merchandise disappear without payment,
retailers either raise prices or shut down entirely. Consumers then blame corporations for greed, while businesses insist they are barely surviving under mounting pressure.
Energy policy has also become part of the affordability debate. The city's aggressive push toward electrification and green infrastructure has increased costs for many residents and businesses. Grocery stores, restaurants, apartment buildings, and transportation systems all rely heavily on electricity, meaning rising energy costs ripple through the entire economy. Every increase eventually reaches consumers standing in checkout lines. Yet, despite years of worsening affordability, many residents continue blaming national politics for problems that existed long before the latest administration took office. Housing shortages, high rents, and expensive living have plagued New York for decades. But political polarization now shapes almost every discussion, causing people to view local failures through a national partisan lens, rather than examining the structural problems surrounding them every day.
What makes the situation especially significant is that the city's political direction reflects the desires of many voters themselves. Leaders promising wealth redistribution, expanded benefits, and aggressive taxation are not hiding their intentions. They campaign openly on those ideas because large numbers of residents support them. That means future politicians will likely promise even larger programs, even broader subsidies, and even more government intervention to win elections. The danger critics warn about is that each new promise requires more money than the previous one. Free buses become demands for free subways. Rent freezes evolve into demands for universal housing guarantees. Subsidized services expand further, while the tax burden on productive sectors keeps growing. Eventually, the financial pressure intensifies on businesses, landlords, and workers who remain in the city.
Landlords especially argue that policies like rent freezes create unintended consequences. If property taxes, maintenance costs, insurance bills, and energy prices continue rising while rental income stays frozen, owners look for ways to recover losses elsewhere. Commercial tenants pay more, non-regulated apartments become more expensive, grocery stores pass costs on to consumers. The burden spreads throughout the economy rather than disappearing. Supporters of these policies insist the alternative would leave vulnerable people completely abandoned in one of the most expensive cities in the world. Opponents counter that dependence on unsustainable systems ultimately creates even greater instability when the funding collapses. And now, New York is beginning to experience exactly what happens when promises exceed resources. What is happening in New York is larger than one mayor, one housing authority, or one voucher program. It is a collision between economic reality and political expectations. Millions of people want affordability, security, and opportunity, but the city remains deeply divided over how to achieve those goals. Some believe the answer is more government involvement. Others believe the answer is unleashing construction, investment, and business growth. As the crisis grows, ordinary residents are the ones trapped in the middle. Families wait years for apartments that remain empty. Workers spend most of their income on rent. Businesses struggle to survive rising costs. RV encampments spread across neighborhoods. Voucher recipients fear losing their homes. And despite all of it, the political battle over what New York should become is only getting more intense.